Hey guys, welcome to part 3 of our irony, sarcasm, and paradox lesson. So we have already introduced you to irony and the 3 types of irony, what that looks like in literature and other parts of media, specifically songs from part 2. And we talked about examples from The Simpsons and other type of comedy shows. So what we're going to move into with part 3 is the paradox piece. So this will be the last literary device that we go over. So you won't need much more than a page. So make sure that you have your notebook out and ready, and you want to continue on from where you left off with the last piece, which was situational irony. If you remember, we watched the lyric PowerPoint video of Alanis Morissette's song Ironic, and that should be the last part of your note. So if you pick back up, you can start with paradox and we will get into that. So make sure you're in as close to a distraction-free environment as possible, please. So think back to the beginning of part 1 when we did our introduction to irony. I mentioned that Robert Frost once said that poetry is one permissible way of saying one thing and meaning another. Saying one thing and meaning another may be accomplished through paradox as well as irony. So you'll want to write this part down. A paradox is a seemingly contradictory statement that actually expresses a possible truth. A paradoxical statement defies logic on the surface, but upon closer reading reveals insight into words that may have seemed like opposites at first. So, for example, Oscar Wilde, a 19th century Irish writer, claimed that, quote, "We live in an age when unnecessary things are our only necessities." Think about that. Unnecessary things and necessities seem on the surface to be contradictory, right? Unnecessary things, things you don't need. Necessities, things you need. So on the surface, when I look at those words, I think, well, those are contradictory. Those clash. Those don't make sense. However, isn't it possible that the author, Wilde, was describing modern human beings quite accurately? Think about that. His paradoxical words certainly seem to ring true today when you think about electronic devices, particular brands of clothing, and expensive vehicles. We view many of these things as our necessities, even though we don't really need them to survive. So in a way, it was also a foreshadowing of modern society as we know it today. So why do poets use irony and paradox in their writing? One answer or possibility is that these literary devices enable the authors to create more subtle and complex or deep differences in tone that convey more meaning to the reader. So when you think about this question, why do poets use irony and paradox? You should be thinking about author's purpose. There are many lessons and writing that you'll analyze, and one of the questions that you should always keep in the back of your mind is, why is the author doing this? I can tell you that there is most likely a reason, and it's your job to investigate why might the author have used this device or said something this way or repeated this line. There's often a reason. It's your job to infer based on what you have in front of you and the background knowledge you have in your brain why that author chose to use the words in the way that he did. So for that example, that is from Oscar Wilde, but we're going to move forward with a little bit of practice with paradox in poetry. And that here, okay. The introduction to this lesson, we talked about paradox being a statement that on the surface, at the beginning, it seems contradictory. So we mentioned that it actually might be expressing something that is possibly true. So this is one of those cliches where things aren't always as they seem. If you've ever heard that, that's sort of what a paradox is. And so a paradoxical statement, this is the part that I told you before to write down, so I just want to make sure that you have this down. A paradoxical statement may seem to defy logic on the surface, but upon closer reading reveals insight into words that may have seemed like opposites at first. Okay? That's the part you need to know. So we'll take some time to practice identifying the use of paradox with a poem. All right, so just make sure that you have this written down. Again, if not, just hit pause and make sure you have this down. So we are going to use the poem called Women by Alice Walker. And it's rather short. I had to split it up into 2 columns just because it was really long and I didn't want to blend the words together. I wanted them to stay on separate lines as they were intended. Okay, so think about the audience, think about the narrator, and the message that you see here when we read this. So I'm going to read it, and then I'm going to give you a second to look back over it and pause if you need to reflect. Okay. They were women then, my mama's generation. Husky of voice, stout of step, with fists as well as hands, how they battered down doors, how they led armies, head ragged generals across mined fields, booby-trapped ditches, to discover books, desks, a place for us. How they knew what we must know without knowing a page of it themselves. Pause, reflect on that. And I'm going to read it one more time. Think about the audience, think about the narrator, think about the message. I'll read it to you one more time. Women by Alice Walker. They were women then, my mama's generation, husky of voice, stout of step, with fists as well as hands, how they battered down doors, how they led armies, had ragged generals across minefields, booby-trapped ditches, to discover books, desks, a place for us, how they knew what we needed, how they knew what we must know without knowing a page of it themselves. Think about that. Again, if you need to pause to reflect, go ahead and do so. So think about who we have here. Who are we talking about? Are we talking about actual soldiers that are battling through a war? See these terms like minefields, generals, booby trap, ditches, armies. I'm talking about these people leading armies. Could it just be that they were fighting for something else? So Walker, the author here, suggests at the end of the poem that they, without knowing a page of it themselves, were fighting for what we must know. So in other words, these women that she refers to in the poem, they were striving, they were fighting, they were doing whatever it takes, going to war, if you will, metaphorically, for education. And we can infer that because we said they were going through all of this to discover books, desks, a place for us. And so this was their fight for education for the generations to come. So if you notice the part where it says, must know without knowing a page of it themselves in the last few lines, then you found the paradox. Because in these 2 lines, Walker suggests that even though the narrator's mother's generation and all the women that she stood beside, they were uneducated, is what she's alluding to here. And yet they still realized the importance of education, and they were willing to do whatever it takes to make sure that their children and their children's children were offered the education that they never had. And so it also speaks to the value and the importance of education, and how even those who don't have it can understand the value in education, and how it's something that some people take for granted. And so this poem by Alice Walker is just one example of many that have the use of paradox within poetry. So if you were able to pull out that paradox, then please give yourselves a pat on the back. If not, keep working on it. What you should have noticed there is when someone is fighting for something, we often assume that they're fighting for something that directly applies to them. And oftentimes in history, that's what happens. This, however, shows that people are willing to do whatever it takes to better future generations. And that's so important. And so this piece sort of highlights that, specifically in regards to the strong women that the narrator comes from. And that is why the paradox at the end of this poem is so powerful, because there's so much passion and purpose behind what this author is saying. So again, if you need to get any of that down, you can go ahead and pause or go back and reread and see if you can identify the paradox there on your own. Obviously, you already know what it is, but you need to be able to not only look at song lyrics like we did in part 2, but you need to be able to look at literature and find irony or sarcasm or paradox. Find when things are written in a way that cause us to think. They cause us to think, is this to be taken literally? And if the answer is no, well then how are we as a reader supposed to read these words? And so it's your job to investigate and find out what the author's intention was in saying something the way that he or she said it. Okay, and so this 3-part series of this lesson should have just given you a little bit more insight into how you would go about doing that. Okay, so I hope you enjoyed looking at some poetry and some songs and learning just how to investigate, identify, and elaborate or explain further what it means to use verbal irony, situational irony, dramatic irony, sarcasm, and even paradox. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next time.